March 1942, the tropical air hung thick and heavy over the newly captured airfield at Lae, New Guinea. American intelligence officers stood in a semicircle around the wreckage of what the Japanese called the Type 1 land-based attack aircraft, what Allied pilots had already begun calling the Betty. The bomber lay crippled on the tarmac, its graceful twin-engine frame still largely intact despite the forced landing that had brought it down. In the punishing afternoon heat, Captain Thomas Wright of the Army Air Force's Technical Intelligence Unit approached the fuselage with a flashlight and a clipboard, prepared for a routine structural analysis. What he discovered in the next 30 minutes would fundamentally alter American understanding of Japanese military philosophy and expose a chasm between two nations' approaches to warfare so profound it bordered on the incomprehensible. The Betty bomber had arrived in the Pacific theater with a fearsome reputation. Throughout late 1941 and early 1942, these sleek aircraft had struck Allied positions across vast oceanic distances with an effectiveness that seemed almost supernatural. They had participated in the devastating assault on Pearl Harbor's airfields. They had hunted Allied shipping from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. They had ranged across thousands of miles of open ocean, appearing suddenly over targets that Allied commanders had believed safely beyond enemy reach, delivering their payload with precision, then vanishing back into the vastness of the Pacific. To the Allied pilots who encountered them in those desperate early months of the war, the Betty seemed to embody Japanese tactical superiority, a weapon that could strike anywhere, anytime, with impunity. But as Captain Wright's team began their systematic inspection of the captured aircraft, pulling back access panels and tracing fuel lines through the bomber's long fuselage, a disturbing picture emerged. The Betty's legendary range, over 600 miles with a full bomb load, came with a price that no American aircraft designer would have ever considered acceptable. The fuel system consisted of multiple large tanks distributed throughout the fuselage and wings, necessary to carry the enormous quantity of aviation gasoline required for those impassable distances. What shocked the American inspectors was not the size or placement of these tanks. It was what surrounded them, or rather, what didn't. Nothing, absolutely nothing. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No armor plating, no self-sealing rubber lining, no carbon dioxide fire suppression system. The thin aluminum skin of the aircraft's fuselage stood as the only barrier between the volatile aviation fuel and the hostile world outside. A single bullet, whether from an enemy fighter's guns or even defensive ground fire, could puncture a tank and expose hundreds of gallons of high-octane gasoline to ignition. The discovery left the American intelligence officers standing in stunned silence, exchanging glances of disbelief. Wright would later write in his official report that examining the Betty's fuel system was like inspecting a flying bomb designed to incinerate its own crew. The contrast could not have been more absolute. By March 1942, every American bomber and most fighters rolling off production lines featured self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. This technology, refined by American and British engineers in the late 1930s, employed multiple layers of rubber compounds that would automatically swell and seal when punctured by enemy fire. Though the self-sealing tanks added significant weight, often hundreds of pounds per aircraft, they had proven themselves invaluable in combat. American pilots shot down over Europe or the Pacific had a fighting chance of nursing damaged aircraft back to friendly territory, their fuel systems bleeding but not erupting into catastrophic fire. The weight penalty was considered not just acceptable but essential, a fundamental requirement of aircraft survival in modern combat. The Japanese designers of the Betty had made a different calculation entirely. They had chosen range over protection, offensive capability over crew survival, the mission over the men who would fly it. Every pound devoted to armor or self-sealing tanks was a pound that could not be allocated to fuel or bombs. In the calculus of the Mitsubishi engineers who designed the aircraft and the Imperial Navy staff who approved its specifications, that trade-off made perfect sense. Japanese naval aviation doctrine in the late 1930s emphasized attack range above all else. The coming war in the Pacific would be decided by which side could strike first across the ocean's vast distances. An aircraft that could reach far enough to hit the enemy before the enemy could respond was worth any sacrifice. If that meant the bomber would burn easily when hit, then the solution was simple: don't get hit. Japanese pilots would rely on fighter escorts, tactical surprise, and their own superior training to avoid enemy fire. This philosophy had seemed vindicated in the war's early months. Between December 1941 and March 1942, Betty bombers had operated with devastating effectiveness across the Pacific, their extraordinary range allowing Japanese forces to project power across distances that Allied planners had thought impossible. When American pilots first encountered formations of Betties over the Philippines and Wake Island, the Japanese bombers often appeared without warning, struck their targets, and withdrew before effective fighter opposition could be organized. The few American fighters that did manage to intercept the raids often found themselves outranged and outmaneuvered by the Betty's Zero fighter escorts. In those chaotic weeks, the Betty's vulnerability seemed theoretical, a design flaw that combat conditions never exposed. But by early 1942, the tactical situation in the Pacific had begun to shift. Allied fighter pilots, though still heavily outnumbered and flying inferior aircraft, were learning to exploit the Betty's fatal weakness. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, flying an F-4F Wildcat during a Japanese raid on the carrier Lexington in February 1942, discovered that when he managed to put rounds into a Betty's fuselage, the results were spectacular and horrifying. The bomber didn't just catch fire, it exploded, transforming in an instant from a functional aircraft into a fireball tumbling from the sky. O'Hare shot down 5 Betties in a single engagement, and in his after-action report, he noted with clinical precision that the enemy bombers burned with extraordinary intensity, suggesting minimal fire suppression capabilities. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for the action, but what stayed with him was not the glory but the ease with which the bombers had died, the way they had bloomed into flame at the first touch of his guns. Other Allied pilots soon confirmed O'Hare's observations. The Betty bomber had earned a new nickname among the Americans, the Flying Zippo, after the popular cigarette lighter that ignited with a flick. Some called it the one-shot lighter. The dark humor masked a growing realization: the Japanese had sent their aircrews to war in aircraft designed with an assumption of invulnerability that combat was proving tragically false. Dutch fighter pilots operating from Java reported that damaged Betties rarely attempted to limp home. Once hit, the bombers either burned immediately or, if the fire started slowly, the crew would often bail out while the aircraft was still controllable, knowing that to stay aboard was to wait for the inevitable explosion. The Betty's crews, superbly trained and courageous, found themselves flying missions in aircraft that offered them almost no chance of survival once enemy fighters penetrated the Japanese fighter screen. Captain Wright and his intelligence team, examining the captured Betty under the harsh New Guinea sun, now understood why Allied pilots reported such devastating results against these bombers. They photographed every fuel tank, traced every line, documented every absent safety feature. Their report would circulate through Army Air Force's headquarters and eventually reach the desks of planners in Washington. The technical details confirmed what combat reports had suggested. Japanese aircraft designers were operating under fundamentally different assumptions about acceptable loss rates and crew survival. The Betty bomber represented not just a different engineering approach, but a different philosophy of human value in warfare. The roots of this philosophy extended deep into Japanese military culture and the specific circumstances of Japan's industrial position in the late 1930s. When the Imperial Navy issued specifications for a new long-range bomber in 1937, Japanese industry faced severe constraints that American manufacturers could scarcely imagine. Japan's industrial base, though growing rapidly, remained modest compared to the Western powers. Aluminum was scarce and expensive. High-grade steel was imported. Aviation fuel production capacity was limited. Every military program competed for inadequate resources. In this environment of scarcity, the concept of spending precious weight capacity on defensive features, armor, self-sealing tanks, redundant systems, seemed almost wasteful. Those pounds could instead extend range, increase bomb load, or improve performance. Moreover, Japanese naval aviation doctrine, shaped by the aggressive theorists who dominated interwar military thinking, emphasized offensive action as the supreme virtue. Defense was passive, uninspiring, ultimately futile. An aircraft's purpose was to deliver ordnance to the target. If the aircraft and crew were lost in achieving that objective, they had nonetheless fulfilled their function. This was not callousness, but rather a coherent military philosophy rooted in both practical resource limitations and cultural assumptions about duty and sacrifice. The samurai tradition, constantly invoked in military training, celebrated death in service as the highest honor. A warrior who returned from battle without achieving his objective had failed, even if he survived. An aircraft designed primarily to protect its crew, rather than to strike the enemy, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of warfare's purpose. American military philosophy, shaped by different cultural values and vastly different industrial capabilities, had evolved along sharply divergent lines. The United States military, particularly after the heavy bomber losses in the early European air campaign, had embraced crew protection not just as a humane priority, but as a practical necessity. A trained aircrew represented a massive investment, months of instruction, thousands of dollars in training costs, irreplaceable combat experience. An aircraft could be replaced in weeks by American industry's prodigious output. A veteran crew took months or years to develop. Thus, American aircraft designers accepted substantial weight penalties to bring crews home. The B-17 Flying Fortress bristled with armor plating and defensive armament. The B-24 Liberator carried self-sealing tanks that added over 1,000 pounds to its empty weight. American fighters sacrificed some performance for cockpit armor and protected fuel systems. These were not soft choices or evidence of overcaution. They were calculated decisions based on a recognition that experienced crews multiplied the effectiveness of every mission they flew. When Captain Wright filed his technical intelligence report on the Betty bomber, he included a section analyzing the strategic implications of Japan's design philosophy. His conclusion was stark. The enemy has chosen to maximize initial striking power at the cost of sustainable operations. Their aircrew casualty rates must be unsustainable in prolonged conflict. As our fighter opposition strengthens, their bomber force will face catastrophic attrition. It was a prescient assessment. Throughout 1942 and 1943, as American fighter strength in the Pacific grew and pilots gained experience, Betty bomber losses mounted steadily. Squadrons that had operated with impunity in the war's first months found themselves suffering 50, 60, even 70% losses on single missions. The unprotected fuel systems that had seemed an acceptable trade-off in 1941 had become death sentences by 1943. Japanese aircrew, with courage that Allied pilots grudgingly acknowledged, continued to fly missions in the Betty despite its reputation as a flying coffin. They understood its vulnerabilities better than anyone. They had watched squadron mates blossom into flame from single hits. They had seen bombers disintegrate in midair when fire reached the main fuel tanks. They knew that every mission might end in a screaming plunge into the ocean, trapped in an aircraft transformed into a furnace. Yet they climbed aboard mission after mission because duty demanded it and because the alternative, refusing to fly, abandoning comrades, failing the Emperor, was unthinkable. Their bravery was never in question. What was increasingly in question was the system that demanded such sacrifice for diminishing returns. The symbolic weight of those unprotected fuel tanks extended far beyond their immediate tactical implications. They represented, in microcosm, the fundamental strategic dilemma Japan faced in the Pacific War. The same resource constraints and philosophical assumptions that led to the Betty's design pervaded Japan's entire war effort. Japanese industry could produce weapons of extraordinary quality and sophistication: the Zero fighter, the Yamato battleship, the Long Lance torpedo, but only in limited quantities and often with critical vulnerabilities stemming from resource scarcity. American industry, blessed with abundant raw materials and massive production capacity, could afford to prioritize both quantity and survivability. American weapons might lack the elegant efficiency of their Japanese counterparts, but they could be produced by the thousands, and they brought their crews home. This disparity manifested in countless ways as the war progressed. Japanese pilots flew without parachutes to save weight. Japanese infantry went into battle with insufficient ammunition, because transport capacity was limited. Japanese ships operated without adequate fuel reserves because oil stocks were chronically short. Each individual decision made tactical sense given Japan's constraints. Collectively, they represented a military philosophy built on accepting sacrifices that America's industrial abundance made unnecessary. The Pacific War became, in many ways, a contest between Japanese refinement and American abundance, between doing more with less and doing more with more. The outcome was never seriously in doubt once America's industrial mobilization reached full capacity. Allied aircrew who encountered Betty bombers in combat experienced a complex mixture of emotions. There was certainly a fierce satisfaction in shooting down enemy aircraft that posed a real threat to Allied ships and bases. But there was also a growing unease at how easily the Bettys burned, how quickly they fell, how little chance their crews had once fire took hold. American pilots, flying aircraft with self-sealing tanks and armor protection, understood implicitly that they benefited from design priorities that valued their survival. The Japanese crews burning in their unprotected bombers had been betrayed by different priorities. Lieutenant John Pugh, a Marine Wildcat pilot who downed 3 Bettys during the Guadalcanal campaign, later wrote in his journal, "They fly with such determination, holding formation even as their brothers burn around them. But their planes betray them. One good burst and they explode like Roman candles. It's not a fair fight, though not in the way I expected. We have the advantage not in skill, but in our aircraft's mercy toward us." The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that Japanese crews developed desperate improvisation to mitigate the danger. Some bombers flew with partially empty fuel tanks, sacrificing range for reduced fire risk. Others carried extra hand-pumped fire extinguishers, though these proved nearly useless once a fuel tank was punctured. Some crews wrapped critical fuel lines in canvas soaked in fire retardant, a measure that might delay catastrophic fire by precious seconds. None of these field expedients addressed the fundamental problem, the fuel system's complete lack of protection. By mid-1943, the Imperial Navy began developing improved versions of the Betty with some measure of fuel tank protection, but these modifications added weight and complexity, reducing the aircraft's range, the very quality that had justified its original design compromises. The improved models arrived too late, and in too few numbers to alter the Betty's reputation or its crew's fate. The intelligence analysis of the captured Betty bomber at WWII circulated through Allied command structures, eventually reaching strategic planners whose concerns extended beyond individual weapons to the broader patterns of Japanese military thinking. What emerged from these analyses was a portrait of an adversary whose military excellence coexisted with strategic vulnerabilities, rooted in resource scarcity and cultural assumptions about acceptable sacrifice. This understanding shaped American strategic decisions throughout the war, where Japanese planners designed for offensive brilliance, assuming a short, decisive conflict. American planners built for sustained attrition warfare, trusting that superior industrial capacity and personnel protection would eventually prove decisive. The contrast between American and Japanese fuel tank design, one side adding hundreds of pounds of protective equipment, the other stripping away every unnecessary ounce, symbolized this strategic divergence as clearly as any grand campaign. The crews who flew the Betty understood their aircraft's nature with an intimacy that no intelligence report could capture. They felt the tension in their bodies during the long flight to target, knowing that the thin aluminum skin around them enclosed thousands of gallons of explosive liquid, with nothing but prayer standing between them and incineration. They watched the sky constantly, not just for enemy fighters, but for the first burst of tracer fire that would spell their doom. They developed superstitions and rituals, carried charms, wrote letters home before every mission with the understanding that each sortie might be their last. And yet they flew mission after mission, because honor demanded it, and because their comrades depended on them, and because in the Japanese military system of 1942 and 1943, individual survival was never the paramount consideration. By 1944, as American forces pressed closer to the Japanese home islands, the strategic bankruptcy of Japan's design philosophy became undeniable. Betty bomber squadrons that had once numbered dozens of aircraft were reduced to handfuls. Veteran crews, irreplaceable and invaluable, had been consumed in flames over Rabaul and Truk and the Philippine Sea. New crews, hastily trained and inexperienced, climbed aboard the remaining Betis knowing they were likely flying to their deaths. The aircraft that had once symbolized Japanese tactical reach now represented the unsustainable cost of prioritizing offensive capability over crew survival. Those unprotected fuel tanks, which had seemed an acceptable trade-off in 1941, had become mass graves for Japan's naval aviation arm. American strategic bombing analysts, studying Japanese aircraft losses throughout the Pacific, noted the Betis' catastrophic attrition rate with clinical interest. In their assessments, the bomber became a case study in false economy. The weight saved by eliminating fuel tank protection, perhaps 800 to 1,000 pounds per aircraft, had purchased additional range that proved increasingly irrelevant as Japanese defensive perimeters contracted. Meanwhile, the loss rates made each Betis sortie exponentially more expensive in terms of crew casualties than equivalent American operations. A veteran American B-17 crew might fly 30 or 40 combat missions, their aircraft battered and patched but still functional, the self-sealing tanks having saved them again and again. A Betis crew faced perhaps 40 or 50% odds of surviving 10 missions. The arithmetic of attrition warfare was unforgiving. America's philosophy of crew protection was not humanitarian sentiment, but hard-headed strategic calculation. The final months of the Pacific War saw the few remaining Betis bombers increasingly relegated to secondary roles, or, most tragically, to suicide missions. The aircraft's tendency to burn when hit made it grimly suitable for kamikaze operations. If the plane was destined to die anyway, why not aim it at an enemy ship? This represented the ultimate degradation of an aircraft that had once been Japan's premier naval bomber. The elegant engineering that had produced such extraordinary range was now valued only for its ability to carry explosives to American vessels. The unprotected fuel tanks, always a vulnerability, became irrelevant when the aircraft's survival was never intended. In this grim evolution, the Betis' design philosophy reached its logical conclusion. An aircraft built without regard for crew survival became an aircraft deliberately sacrificing crew survival. When the war ended in August 1945, only a handful of Betis bombers remained operational. Most had been consumed in the flames their designers had made inevitable, their crews burned or blown apart in the sky over the Pacific. American occupation forces, surveying captured Japanese aircraft at airfields across the home islands, found derelict Betis cannibalized for parts, their fuel tanks dry and their aluminum skins corroded. Technical intelligence teams conducted detailed post-war examinations, documenting every aspect of the aircraft's design for the historical record. The absence of fuel tank protection, which had so shocked Captain Wright back in March 1942, now seemed merely confirmation of what everyone had learned through bitter experience. Japanese military design had been shaped by constraints and assumptions that led to weapons of extraordinary capability and extraordinary vulnerability in equal measure. The legacy of the Betis bomber extended beyond its tactical history into post-war analysis of military design philosophy. American aircraft designers, studying captured Japanese aircraft and combat reports, took away lessons about the dangers of over-optimization. The Betis represented an extreme example of designing for a single priority, range, while accepting catastrophic vulnerabilities in other areas. This approach produced brilliant performance in its intended role, but collapsed when combat conditions deviated from assumptions. American design philosophy, influenced by these lessons, moved further toward balanced capabilities and crew protection. The Strategic Air Command bombers of the Cold War, the B-47, the B-52, carried extensive defensive systems, redundant controls, and protected fuel systems as a matter of course. They sacrificed some performance, some efficiency, some elegance to bring their crews home. The ghost of the burning Betis hung over those design decisions, a cautionary reminder of what happened when designers forgot that weapons were tools for humans, not the other way around. For the American intelligence officers who first examined that captured Betis at Lee in March 1942, the discovery of the unprotected fuel tanks represented a moment of profound revelation. They had expected to find sophisticated enemy technology, perhaps even systems superior to American equivalents. Instead, they found a weapon built on assumptions so different from their own that it required a fundamental recalibration of their understanding. The Berry was not inferior engineering. It was engineering in service of a different hierarchy of values. Those values prioritized mission over men, attack over defense, elegance over robustness. In the context of Japan's resources and military culture, those priorities were internally consistent. In the context of a prolonged war against America's industrial might, they were catastrophic. The unprotected fuel tanks of the Berry bomber, empty now and silent, stand in memory as a symbol of the irreconcilable difference between abundance and scarcity, between philosophies that saw humans as resources to be protected and philosophies that saw humans as assets to be expended. There was courage on both sides of the Pacific War, ingenuity on both sides, dedication and sacrifice. But there was also this fundamental divergence in how societies valued the lives of their warriors. American pilots climbed into aircraft designed to bring them home. Japanese pilots climbed into aircraft designed to reach the target, with survival a secondary consideration at best. Those differences, embodied in pounds of rubber and layers of armor, determined more about the war's outcome than all the tactical brilliance or strategic planning on either side. The story of the Berry bomber is ultimately a story about choices. The choices engineers made in design offices, the choices strategists made in planning rooms, the choices cultures made about the value of individual life weighed against collective goals. In March 1942, when Captain Wright discovered those naked fuel tanks, he was seeing the physical manifestation of choices Japan had made years earlier, choices that seemed logical in their original context, but which combat was revealing as fatal. The American choice, to build heavier, less elegant aircraft that protected their crews, seemed wasteful to Japanese eyes but proved sustainable in ways Japan's refined efficiency could never match. In the end, abundance defeated scarcity, protection defeated vulnerability, and the Berry bombers burned in the Pacific sky like tragic monuments to a philosophy that valued the weapon over the warrior.